Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. I'm Bruce Jackson. I am now the chair of the Scottish Council on Archives, and I'd just like to welcome you all to this webinar, which is then going to lead into the annual general meeting of the SCA. Obviously, it's the first time we've done anything like this in this remote way. So if there are any difficulties anybody experiences at any point, apologies for that. We'll try and keep things ticking along as they go. What we're going to do this morning is I'm just going to get Caroline Brown, who is the convener of the SCA Collections Development Working Group, to talk to you about the general context of collection development in SCA, and then Victoria, who's the Programs and Development Manager at SCA, will sort of take over the management of the webinar, just to introduce people and get things moving through on time. Okay, so over to Caroline, and as I say, just bear with us if there's any complications. I'll just mute now.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Bruce. So, hi everyone. Thanks very much for attending. I'm Caroline Brown. I'm the archivist at the University of Dundee, and I'm currently the chair of the Scottish Council on Archives working group, collecting working group. This working group started in an initiative by the Scottish Council on Archives in 2016 to share information about collecting policies. And when we were having those discussions, we kind of realised how, I don't know why I'm sounding surprised, but we realised how important collecting is to archive services, and that there are so many different issues relating to collecting that we really felt it was important to form a working group to look at some of these in more detail. So we had an event actually in 2017, which was a kind of consultation with the sector in terms of what the issues were, what questions people had, and what people really wanted to have discussions about. And this led to the working group doing quite a lot of work in terms of how best to meet the needs of people in the archive community around collecting. And we developed a framework which is available on the website of the Scottish Council on Archives. And the framework is really all about helping each other in terms of best practice and encouraging dialogues. There's a really useful list of issues from different sectors in the profession up there. And we hope it'll be useful in terms of people developing their own collection policies and collection development approaches. It was launched at the annual members meeting last year, and Victoria's going to tell you about the work that the working group has done since then, because we've been quite busy since then. But before I hand you over to Victoria, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that having been on this working group has demonstrated to me again the importance of this area. And I think that's reflected in accreditation in terms of the emphasis it gives to proper policies and plans and procedures. We're all facing resource issues, and one of the issues that a lot of us are coming across is deaccessioning, because of pressures in terms of resource, and also recent conversations about diversity and inclusion and representation leads directions and collecting development. So I think it's really important that the SCA continues with this work, and I'll just hand over to Victoria so she can tell you about what we're doing at the moment.
Hi everyone, thanks Carolyn. I'm Victoria Brown, the Programs and Development Manager for SCA. And as Carolyn was giving a bit of an overview of the group, my role is to support and manage the work of the group. And like many of us in the past 6 months, we've been responding to some of the challenges that the pandemic has presented to all of us. And when the working group met in April, we became really aware of just an enormous amount of activity around the response to collecting in the COVID-19 context. And alongside that, there's a lot of issues, that have emerged, but also some real opportunities. And the group decided that in light of all of the really interesting initiatives and responses we were seeing, that we'd put together a central web page so that we could share and promote, some of these great projects and responses. So that's been really quite successful, and we've had 26 entries from a wide variety of services across Scotland. And yeah, and what's been quite a difficult and challenging time for a lot of people, it's been a really positive and really quite inspiring thing to see happening across the sector. So the purpose of today is to not exhaustively answer all of these issues or explore all of these projects, but to touch on some examples and yeah, to have a bit of discussion about what different services are doing in response to this. Yeah, a particular project being led by OurStory Scotland, a voluntary response. And yeah, so we're really pleased to have a variety of speakers along today to talk about what they're doing. And to follow on from that, this isn't going to be the first and last event of this kind that we're going to hold on this topic, because what we've become aware of is that, as Carolyn was touching on, collections development, it's a really broad area and there's a real need, evidenced across the sector, for more support and dialogue and discussion around this. So we do have plans afoot based on the responses that we've gotten from the sector about your needs around different guidance and training. Yeah, and opportunities to discuss issues related to collections development. So over the next year, we will be putting on further webinars and events around specific topics that you've let us know that you'd like to look at in more depth. So I won't say much more about that, but it's just something to look out for in the next year. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Elena Carter, who's the archivist at the Wellcome Trust. And Ellen has very kindly agreed to give us an overview of some work that she's been doing with the Collecting COVID, or Contemporary Collecting COVID-19 network. So I'm going to pass over to Elena. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, it's great to be here today. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm going to assume that you can hear me, but just say if you can't. I'm going to also just attempt to share my screen and hope that that works. You sort of feel like by this stage in the pandemic, you should be like a complete whiz at Zoom and all of this, but I'm getting there. Okay, share screen. Okay, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint there. Nods, that's good. And you still see the PowerPoint. My notes haven't come up in the way. Okay, so I was just going to talk through a bit of the work that sort of has been happening kind of more broadly. So across collections and repositories and museums all over the UK, really, and thinking about the role that I've played within that and the role that others have played, and yeah, really why we're at where we're at the moment and the different issues that have come up as we've been discussing things. So just for context, I'm the collections development archivist at Wellcome. We have a specific collections development team, but we are a very small team. So it's me, one other archivist whose work mostly focuses on internal collecting around the institutional archive for the Wellcome Trust, and then a collections development librarian, and then our manager. So it's a small team considering how much we try to do, really, which I'm sure is something that everyone feels as well within their institutions. So within those sort of early days of the shock of adjusting to lockdown and to working from home, we could sort of sense the importance, as I'm sure everyone else could, of the events which were changing and shifting and unfolding, and the need to sort of think about how we capture the experiences of COVID-19 through contemporary collecting. For Wellcome, our focus is on collecting material that challenges the way that we think and feel about health. So obviously, in the face of a global health emergency, collecting around COVID-19 felt particularly relevant to our mission and interests. But it was quite clear very early on that also this area was going to cross over many different collecting areas and was something that was touching upon all different parts of life and people's experiences. So it was soon quite clear to us that we couldn't just think about what we were interested in, but we also needed to understand what other institutions were exploring and what they were hoping to collect. And this was something that felt really important to us because we wanted to make sure we were doing things in a joined up way. We wanted to understand each other's priorities and focuses and make sure that we weren't either duplicating work or missing out important things as well. So before launching into this, we took a bit of time to pause and reflect and to think about how we might go about doing rapid response collecting. So we do have a small amount of experience of collecting during global health crises. So we did some collecting in response to the Ebola outbreak in 2014 and to Zika in 2015. But both of these were small scale collecting and mostly involved printed and published material. But there was quite a lot that we learned from both of those experiences, and it really sort of brought to the fore some of the ethical issues around collecting during a health emergency. So for the Ebola outbreak, we'd funded some oral histories with people who were affected by Ebola. And the emphasis for that was really on collecting those stories in the moment. And as a result of that, and as a result of us sort of trying to work at speed to make sure those stories weren't lost, it meant that on the flip side of that, we didn't collect some of the normally vital documentation around informed consent, for example, which means that the long-term accessibility of the material is more problematic now. And some of this is, has been possible to rectify retrospectively, but the amount of work that it's created after the fact to get that paperwork in place has been quite large. So we really wanted to make sure that this time we were learning from those experiences. We were making sure that we were aware that, you know, that we didn't want to rush into anything until we knew exactly what it was that we were setting out to achieve. From the Ebola experiences as well, we were thinking that there is often that desire to act in the fear that things will just disappear, but that actually it's more important to make sure you've got those core principles in place. Equally, you know, at the start of lockdown, with everyone going to moving at home and thinking about their caring responsibilities and their family and friends, we were trying to be mindful of avoiding burnout within ourselves and our colleagues, and avoiding any adverse impacts on staff members as well as those we were collecting records from. We wanted as well to be very considered in our approach and to remember that we're just a small part of a much larger community of libraries, archives, galleries and museums with whom we need to collaborate. We wanted to behave sensitively and to tread carefully. So I'm just going to, hopefully you can see the next slide there, which is the principles that we developed. So we wanted to behave sensitively and to tread carefully on this, to show awareness of the fatality of the virus, and the fact that we were going to be dealing with things that are difficult and traumatic and hard. And that those things don't mean that we shouldn't be collecting this material necessarily, but it does mean that we need to be highly sensitive and aware of what it is that we're entering into. So it was important to us that the collecting was in accordance with our collections development policy, that we were making sure that things end up in the right place. and that's through communication with other places, that we were considered, properly planned, and making sure everything was properly documented. As I mentioned, that we were respectful of lived experience and sensitive of the emotions and traumas that many people are going through. And also, which is carrying on from previous ethical work we've done around artists and lived experience, making sure that that artists and those who create work are paid a fair price for their work. So that was sort of our starting point for what we wanted to achieve. The network itself was sort of born out of these principles and out of wanting to find ways to connect with each other, because we were aware, okay, we're interested in, you know, as I said, how we think and feel about health. That's pretty much as broad as it can get when you're thinking about COVID-19 collecting. So it was important to us to make sure that we knew sort of where the boundaries were of our collecting and where other people's collecting interweaves with that, and where other people have strengths that we don't have, so that we could get a better sense sort of the landscape of collecting that was going on. And the network really builds on very important work that's already been done by other people. So it's not sprung out of thin air, but has come out of the work that's been done by museum workers Ellie Miles at the London Transport Museum and Imogen Clark at the Science Museum. So they'd already worked on setting up a mailing list for contemporary collecting in museums. And Ellie had been working with the London Transport Museum on producing a contemporary toolkit for collecting. And that toolkit was actually fortuitously published in April after a year's worth of work. So if you haven't seen that yet, if you just Google London Transport Museum contemporary collecting toolkit or something along those lines, it will pop up. It's really useful. It sort of talks about, gives lots of case studies about different experiences of dealing with records in a contemporary context. So building on the work that had been done by these other people around contemporary collecting, we felt it was important to have something that was focusing on COVID-19 to sort of deal with the scale of record collecting that could be happening at this time. So we set up a Slack channel. There's a shot of it just there. Slack's just a messaging service. So it just allows you to have different channels so that people can just chat with each other on particular topics. So talk about ethics or institutional collecting or collecting tools and software, etc. The Slack channel has been really great to get people talking to each other and speaking in quite an informal way, rather than feeling like they have to work out who they need to contact at a particular institution. So it just allows for like some quite quick, easy and non-hierarchical discussions to take place. And we've got nearly 400 members on there now, which is really great to see, although it's much less active than it used to be, but it's still a useful place to connect with people and to see links that are being shared. So we've arranged Zoom calls and had sessions on particular subjects that are of interest to people who are concerned with contemporary collecting. All of those are open to anyone. So if you're in this call and you want to come along to any of our future sessions, like feel free to get in touch or join the Slack channel. Some of the key issues arising from the network have been around ethics, understandably. So something in particular has been thinking about traumatic experiences and the potential of PTSD. So in one of our early calls where we were talking about oral history, the Royal College of Nursing talked about this, and in relation to the fact that they weren't doing oral history at the moment. And the Oral History Society have issued some guidance for people who are continuing to do oral history at this time, but generally have advised that it would be better to hold off on that where it's possible. So for other projects, it has been possible to undertake oral history because they have those relationships already in place, or because they're bound by certain funding and things need to be completed within a certain time frame, so they've had to move to doing things remotely. But we had some very interesting discussions around trauma and sharing of experiences, and about how oral history could actually be a source of comfort for people to share their experiences, but on the other hand, perhaps that we as archivists and museum workers are not equipped to handle this. We're not trained therapists, and perhaps individuals don't always know something's going to be traumatic until they're retelling those experiences. So that was just one of the things that we were talking about, which I think has come up before with other areas, but I think is particularly key with COVID-19 when it's so so dominant in people's minds, and the risks are still so high and it's ongoing. Another consideration was around frontline workers and whistleblowers. So we talked in a recent meeting about the possible future uses of records for things like inquiries into COVID-19, and about how these future uses of the records are not necessarily what we have in the front of our mind as archivists when we're thinking about collecting records, but actually it's really important that we're aware of how materials could be used within a public inquiry, and the impact that this could have on trust with donors, and how we can ethically collect when we know that this could be a possibility. So for example, thinking about whistleblowing around lack of PPE, activities such as being at protests or taking part in illegal activity. So for example, on the topic of protests, the Black Cultural Archives, who are collecting on Black Lives Matter, have specifically asked that photos submitted are blurred and that you can't see participants in order to protect the record creators. There's also issues around knowing when to get in contact, and not chasing people, being aware that people have lots of things going on at the moment that we can't always be aware of. So the relationship with donors becomes even more important for thinking about that, how we have that human approach and how we make sure that we're being tactful and sensitive to whatever might be going on in someone's personal life. Of course, the practical issues have come up massively as well. You know, with the resource required to run collecting work, particularly in the many places where staff have been furloughed or have been placed under additional stress, or resources have been diverted elsewhere. One of the big topics that's come up a few times is around internal pressures. So pressures within archives and museums or from the institutions that they're part of to launch public call outs to collect, or to promote collecting via social media, where this is perhaps not what the archives would have wanted to do or would have been the approach that they would have taken necessarily. We've spoken with people who have said that they have done public call outs and that they've had really high responses, but then also thinking about the practicalities of what it means to manage hundreds of emails and offers coming in. And then of course there's the challenge of actually acquiring material in the present climate, when most people don't have access to their offices and can't take things physically in. There's also the risk of transmission via objects, so collecting things has been more difficult in terms of not wanting to put anyone at risk when they're collecting stuff in. A really positive thing that seems to have come out of it, just to close up, because I think I'm probably rambling now, is around digital collecting. And I think for a lot of places, as ever, this feels like it's new territory where things aren't quite in place to the standard. The thing here seems to be that in this new climate and being working from home and not having access to physical stuff, it seems like a lot of places are taking on the mentality of just trying to get on with that and to do the best that they can with digital preservation, rather than waiting until they have the absolute gold standard of digital preservation in place. So finally, just to end with a bit about what we're doing at Wellcome, there's a few different strands to our work. So my colleague Trudy has been focusing on internally staff experiences and the Wellcome institutional archive. And this is just to show you our form, which is just through, it's just a Microsoft online form where people are able to submit materials about their own experiences as staff members. And this might relate to what it's been like for them to work from home, how their role has been impacted, but also more personal things like their health and well-being and the experience of lockdown. And we're collecting that alongside the more traditional records of Wellcome's scientific response, of conversations that are happening through our intranet and so on. We're also looking at collecting artwork, collecting printed and published material, including zines and graphic medicine. And my role is focusing on sort of trying to connect with people in the wider sector, and also to try and develop our archival holdings even, around COVID-19, and to continue to develop relationships with institutions who we have ongoing relationships with surrounding accruals to the collections. So that's just a very quick run through. Obviously there's loads of stuff that's been discussed, but I would be happy to answer questions, which I think are going to happen at the end anyway. So I'll just stop now because I've probably gone over 15 minutes, so sorry if I have.
Oh, thank you, Elena, and thank you for managing to cram so many key issues into a short space. It was really, really good, thank you. I'm going to introduce now Vibeke McGee, the archivist at North Lanarkshire Archives, and she's going to talk a bit about collecting priorities in the local authority context.
Okay, hello, I'm going to share my presentation too. Let me see, that should be it. Share. Oh, that's already stormed ahead. Let's see, can I go back? Okay, give me a second. Try that again. Let's try this. And then from the beginning. Oh, I'm stuck. Let me see. Oh no, now it's working. Okay, so my name is Vibeke McGee and I'm the archivist for North Lanarkshire Council, and I'm going to talk about our COVID-19 collecting priorities in the context of local authority archives. So I think a lot of what I'll be talking about might apply to other local authorities as well in general. So here we go. So on 23rd of March 2020, Scotland went into lockdown, and this changed the way the people of North Lanarkshire lived and worked, and how North Lanarkshire Council carried out their key tasks. So with such dramatic change, how would we in the archive be able to document this? This was a question that kind of came about very quickly because we got all the updates from the chief executive, you know, how all the council services changed and so on. So we very quickly thought about how are we going to document changes in service delivery from within the local authority. But then very early in the pandemic, some archives put out public appeals for people to maybe keep diaries and then submit them to the archive. And this was for various reasons. So I think some people just kind of felt something has to happen now very quickly. And also I know I think it was Stirling University Archives, they work together with their sort of mental health people, and they try to encourage people to keep diaries for the mental well-being of their students. So this then prompted us within North Lanarkshire to think about what and how wide our approach to collecting COVID-19 related material would be. So conveniently in our setup in North Lanarkshire, archives, records management, curatorial services and local studies are all placed within the same service of museums and heritage. So we had an extensive discussion with colleagues in museums and local studies to draw up a procedure just to kind of discuss all the different materials that could be collected and who would be collecting them and for what purpose and when. So we've got a quite comprehensive spreadsheet, which is very useful for us to refer back to in the future as a point of reference, our collecting approach. And then basically just kind of echoing a bit what Elena said as well, that we decided together that we would not put out an appeal for anything immediately, but we would only put out a statement on our website and on social media outlining our joint approach. And it was felt that while so many people were going through very difficult times, an appeal for what would probably sound a bit like we were looking for your lockdown memories would automatically favor a response from people who maybe were able to use the time to start a new hobby or draw pictures rather than people who had experienced a difficult, more difficult times during this this initial lockdown and high infectious period in the pandemic. And I've been sort of following a bit the Corona Archive in Germany, which is a university project where historians are basically trying to appeal to people to submit their memories of the pandemic, and it started out very early in the lockdown. And what they've been saying is that in the beginning, all they received was rainbow toilet paper and so on pictures. But only now, more recently, that Germany has come out of the lockdown, they got more material regarding people kind of telling them about how difficult it has been, or just kind of sort of different types of experience than when the situation was quite difficult for everybody. So we published a collecting intention statement on our website, and that's also included in the SCA's link page. So we were saying in our statement that the COVID-19 pandemic is an event of local as well as global significance, which will have far-reaching effects on our lives for a long time to come. So we were also already thinking this is not going to be just something about a few months. At the beginning, we didn't think it was going to be lots of months, but maybe a few weeks. But anyway, a short period of lockdown. But this is something that will have long-reaching effects in the future. That became clear quite quickly as well. And then we were saying that our Museums and Heritage Service are committed to collecting and preserving a record of this time to provide future generations with insight into how people and organizations in North Lanarkshire coped with and were affected by the pandemic. And a part of this project involves capturing the diverse everyday experience of people from all walks of life in North Lanarkshire, and then kind of asking people for their help, but basically saying just keep an eye on this website. We haven't done anything since then regarding this because we're trying to open up our services and so on as well. But we will revisit this quite soon. So then we thought about how are we going to split things up across the heritage services. So as I said, it's very useful for us that we have our sister services, curatorial and local studies. So our curatorial services are in general in charge of oral histories. So they have all the experience and training regarding how to conduct an oral history interview. And they would then at some point put out an appeal to maybe particular groups of people, I don't know, like nurses who worked in an intensive care ward, or bin men, or just various sort of different key workers maybe, and then other people, how grandparents, how people experience the time. And then they would also obviously be looking for objects that could be anything, so something very personal, or a work health and safety, PPE. It could be sort of anything that has a connection with the pandemic. And they would also look for artwork, and just similar to what Elena was saying, they would also be looking to commission artwork for maybe an exhibition that reflects the experience of the pandemic. And then our local studies service, they collect our newspapers. There's a bit of a problem because as soon as the pandemic, as the lockdown started, our libraries stopped receiving physical newspapers. So we have to kind of see how we make sure we fill that gap, and make sure we definitely have the newspapers for that time period. And they would also be looking at leaflets and other sort of published ephemera. So where does this leave us in our archive? So within North Lanarkshire Archives and Records Management, we decided not to change our collecting policy, but to use it to guide our focus. And this is kind of what Caroline said earlier on as well, how important a collecting policy statement is in that kind of context. So in our collecting policy, we say that North Lanarkshire Archives exist to collect, preserve and make available to the public the historical records of North Lanarkshire Council and its predecessors, as well as private records of historical or research interest relating to North Lanarkshire. And then we kind of explain what it kind of means in our context or the previous administrations of the area. And then regarding private records, we look for anything that's been going on or is going on in North Lanarkshire, past and present, records of individuals, families, estates, businesses, organizations, institutions, club society, and so on. But obviously, we wouldn't be able to kind of tackle everything at once. So we decided to have kind of two main focus to direct in two main directions. One is our own local authorities' decision-making processes and how they manage the pandemic for the people living in North Lanarkshire. And then we were looking at, partly also through our own council services, at the sort of public experience. And the reason why we wanted to focus on the decision making, first of all, was that we've, over the last few years, as many other local authority archives, had a lot of experience of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry and working on Section 21 notices. And we were obviously aware that it's very likely there's going to be a public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic, and especially regarding care homes. So we were quite keen to get in touch early on with social work services to make sure that all the kind of guidance and they received and they passed on and so on was going to be preserved. And then the other strand would be sort of more public life. And again, we probably initially will take inspiration from what's been going on within the council. The Provost Office, our Provost has been quite active. There's youth work services and community learning and development. They've been quite active on Twitter and other social media. So you can kind of get an idea of what's been going on and start collecting from that perspective, and then maybe that will open up avenues to other groups we can collect from. So our priorities were, first of all, to collect from chief executives and committee services, make sure, I'll go on into more detail in a moment, social work / health and social care, education, and resilience development, corporate communications, and then we go into the sort of more public side of things, the Provost Office, the youth work and the community learning and development. So our chief executives and committee services, we were kind of alerted there was quite a change there, because on 26th of March, they announced that all meetings of council committees, the council and elected member surgeries were stood down. And any urgent business was being progressed through the chief executive's delegate authority. So that kind of made us kind of wonder, you know, how are they recording these decisions? Is it going to be in place of how things were recorded before, or is it going to be something new? So we started getting in touch with sort of key members of staff just to kind of start the conversation going. Regarding them. Then social work, as I said before, we've been heavily involved with social work because of the child abuse inquiry. So as part of a general review of social work records and their preservation, we will be looking particularly at policies and procedures, their knowledge base, and also what's going to happen with client files, because obviously at the moment they have not a permanent retention, a very long retention, but not permanent. So whether there's a need to review things there. And we've got from our corporate communications, there's some kind of pictures from the Campus Nest and Children's Home as well, just to illustrate things that were going on more on the kind of outward facing side. Then in education, we talked to colleagues there that we would be interested in circular letters to pupils and parents, examples of homework blogs, then guidelines for setting up classrooms for children of key workers initially, then how the going back to school was planned for, and then as a sort of a new area, we sometimes receive these sort of things from decades ago because they just happened to survive in school. But we would have to kind of work out on a process how we could actually collect some samples of pupils' work that was maybe created during lockdown and that reflected on lockdown or the whole experience of the pandemic. And then going to more to the public side as an illustration, there's lots of things been going on in the digital sphere. So, but this is our provost councillor, Jean Jones. So she's been quite active on social media, carrying out some competitions. She did a TikTok challenge and all kinds of things. So there are things that she asked for. People were supposed to submit a poem about what they've missed most during lockdown. Or they had to do an acrostic challenge, write some thoughts with the letters forming the word lockdown there. So with all of this, we have all these ideas of what we want to collect, but the main challenge for us also, as Ellen already said, is the formats of what's been created. So as many archives, we've been thinking about digital preservation and have acquired knowledge about digital preservation, but in practice, not a lot has happened. So now we are aware that there's a multitude of digital formats, Facebook websites, Twitter, Microsoft Teams meetings, WebEx meetings, and so on. And we will have to carry out a survey of the records we want to collect now and in what format they come in. That's, I think, our biggest challenge. We're kind of hoping that for some things there might still be paper records, but I think that might be not very realistic. I think most things will be in digital, and for us, it's kind of been raising the profile of maybe the importance of digital preservation within the council, and then we kind of hope that we can carry that over into when we ask maybe the public to submit material as well, because again we expect a lot of material to be in the digital in the digital format. So our next steps is to continue to work with services and using our retention schedules to identify relevant record series and whether their retention will change due to the COVID-19 context. And then further developing our digital preservation processes. And we have taken Digital Preservation Coalition training recently, and we've produced now a report to our data management team regarding how to progress our digital collections. And that's certainly more people are listening to this now because they're aware that over the last few months how everything has moved into the digital world. So that was our wee summary from North Lanarkshire. If you've got any questions later on, I'd be happy to answer. And there's my email address as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Vibka. I'm going to, I know time's ticking along, so I'm going to hand over now. We have a double act with Jamie Valentine, the chair of OurStory Scotland, and we've also got Dom Miller-Graham, who's a researcher, and they're going to speak a bit about a project that they've recently been running. So over to you, Jamie and Dom.
Hello, I'll perhaps say a bit about OurStory Scotland to begin with, Victoria, which is OurStory Scotland has been going for a long time now. We were founded in 2002, and I think that, I'm sorry, I'm looking at myself on the screen. I'd rather look at somebody else on the screen. Victoria, could we have you? Oh no, it's probably not possible. All right, I'm going to look at the side of the screen. We've been going since 2002. We are a charity which is devoted to collecting, archiving and presenting the stories of the LGBT community in Scotland. And we are somewhat unusual. We realized this particularly last week when we were asked to participate in a Four Nations webinar on behalf of the Oral History Society, a special interest group looking at LGBT people. And it was clear that in other parts of the UK, this kind of national approach doesn't appear to be going on, of collecting oral histories on a national basis. And also people were not aware of a kind of index or guide to where they could find LGBT research materials. In Scotland, we have this in the National Library of Scotland. They have a guide to LGBT research materials. You can look up this if you just Google that, you'll find it in relation to Scotland. It's a web page on the National Library of Scotland. It's kept up to date. And if you find that in your own particular archives you have material which is relevant to LGBT people, then do get in touch with the National Library of Scotland to update the web page. It's an ongoing web page. You'll find if you look there that our own materials are in a distributed archive. So they are available at the National Library of Scotland in the form of oral histories. They're available at the National Museum of Scotland, particularly in the form of handwritten episodes and artistic objects where people have expressed their stories through artistic means. And we also have an archive at the Mitchell Library in terms of the ongoing organisational records of OurStory Scotland itself, as well as some material that's been donated to us. You may be interested to know that donations of material have actually, or inquiries about that have actually increased during the COVID times. We've had more people spending more time at home. They are more aware of their cupboards and their lofts and material which they have available there, and they're wanting to make sure that these are preserved. If you bear in mind also, people are aware of their own fragility and the fragility of organizations.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Janie, but I know I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if you're able to turn your microphone up.
Right, let me see if I can do that. No, it's important. Where would I do that?
It might just be your own computer's volume. Turn that up a wee bit and see what happens.
The computer volume is up, but I'm just going to have a look at the... That's just testing a microphone. That's irrelevant. I'm just trying to audio settings. Let's put the microphone I'm putting up now to maximum volume. Okay, is that better?
Much better, much better.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much, Victoria, because that would have been a bit silly not to have that. I now have to close that window. Is that still the same level?
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay. So we have a distributed archive, and we have our oral history interviews at the National Library of Scotland. We have a collection of more than 170 already handwritten episodes at the National Museum of Scotland, along with various artistic objects, and we have the records of the institution archived at the Mitchell Library. And I was saying that you may be interested to know that we've had more requests for archiving our material since we've been doing our research during COVID times. People have got in touch with us, and they've obviously had the time to realize that they've got material which they need to have recorded. They maybe have had the time to look in their lofts and cupboards and realize they have this material that they want to have archived, and they also realize the fragility both of themselves and of institutions and organizations they're working with. And so we've had more requests of that. We can't always archive that at all. In fact, we don't have an archive. Our archives are elsewhere, but we can often direct people in the right area of where they may be interested in that. The pandemic has influenced our work in rather obvious ways. The most obvious way is that we can't any longer do what has been at the heart of our storytelling, which has been collecting oral histories in face-to-face interviews done according to the guidelines suggested by the Oral History Society. What we also cannot do is have events at which we get people to handwrite their episodes. So both of these, which are probably the core of what we've been doing, have been impossible. And we didn't want to stop collecting people's stories. We could devote ourselves to preparing everything we got for archive, and we obviously have been able to do that. But in addition, we want, and we think it's very important for our community to continue having the ability to tell their stories at this time, which is particularly difficult for them. So what we've done is we've developed a new project, which is called the Queer Distance Project. We've always done digital collecting, we've always done online storytelling, but this flags it up as particularly important at the present time. It also has allowed us to adapt in particular ways so that we can extend this and make it more relevant to a particular pandemic context. So if you look at the abilities, the facilities that people have in Queer Distance, we have various online forms. We have a form that we've had there for a long time, which is a questionnaire, which sounds as if it's going to be very formal and very yes, no answers. It's not like that. It's really a series of questions which get you to talk about areas of your life that may interest you to talk about. They're very open-ended questions. You could write a whole book in reply to some of them. For example, what is the best and the worst thing to have happened to you at school? Many people could write a 3-volume novel in relation to that. So, and we don't put any limit on it, so people can write as much or as little as they want. In addition to that, we have a form which is related to observation. And originally this was about going to a place and observing a place, a public place where you feel comfortable in being yourself as an LGBT person. And we found that obviously that has to be adapted now. Ironically, people are even more aware of the importance of those places as those places become less accessible and as they miss them. So that becomes very important in our work, and we want to capture that through the online storytelling that people can offer. We're developing this also with the Glasgow Doors Open Festival, where we are doing a session with them where people are able to offer their observation of a place that they remember as being particularly significant for them, even if they cannot access it now. And this becomes part of a wider Queering the Map project, which we're sharing with the Scottish Civic Trust. In addition to that, we want people to have snapshots of a particular time, either an episode which was significant in their life and they can now submit that digitally online, or a diary of their time in what is for many LGBT people, and Dom's going to speak a bit more about this, a time which is particularly significant for our community, particularly difficult and presenting a lot of challenges, special challenges which need to be reflected and which need to be recorded. And in addition to that, we don't want to abandon entirely our oral history approach. The Oral History Society suggests that while you don't try and do full-length oral histories, what you might want to do is short, remote recordings on particular themes. And one of the themes would be, what has it been like for you during lockdown? And that is something which, again, Dom is going to talk about. So Dom, maybe you can take over here and talk about why it's important for our community to collect stories about the virus during this particular time.
It's interesting to hear everyone else talk about risks of collecting and the risks to the community. And I think the risks of us not collecting these stories and these experiences is a lot higher than the risks that can easily be contradicted, like cross-contamination and social distancing. Doing even right away the Queer Distance Project, we don't just archive, we like to storytell, we like to share this information so people can learn, and it's really important for our community to hear this information. And some of the things that have come up already are that LGBT people don't feel worthy enough or important enough to ask for help during the pandemic when they are in desperate situations and they need aid, the impact on healthcare, online spaces. We've all went online, but online spaces are not equal places. LGBT youth have also reported on the dangers of online spaces, the dangers of online bullying, and how much we use Zoom. Zoom's particularly triggering for dysphoria, so trans and non-binary people are already feeling excluded from these spaces. Seeing yourself, hearing your own voice can be very, very triggering. We kind of had a head start on digital storytelling as well. We were approached by another charity, Pink Saltire, and we put together, in collaboration with them, a podcast series. I was doing that project when lockdown hit. Again, it was funded, it was all over the country, and again, it was focusing on a vulnerable minority. It was over 50s LGBT community. So I had to be cut short, but I got 28 hours of audio that will all be used to create a series, and will all be archived at the National Library, like James said. But these interviews have become quite sought after because everybody's wanting digital storytelling, digital spaces. So we're putting something together for HR managers, for local authorities, so we can share that lived experience, so people can respond in relation to their policy. The Carnegie Trust's just done a big 6-year study about empowering communities and about storytelling should be at the centre of all policy making. So it's really important that we don't hoard our archives, but actually get that out into the public space. Something that an extension to Queer Distance is the Queer Distance Reaching Out programme, and that is something that's in response to something that's been highlighted in nearly all the work that we do, is that our community is incredibly diverse. It's incredibly diverse in identities, subcultures, race, religion, the lot. So we want to kind of bring people together to have conversations. During this time, we can use digital technology to have short themed interviews in relation to breaking down those barriers within our own community. If you're a gay man, you have no idea what it's like for a teenage lesbian, and it's to break down those barriers, open up the different subcultures within our community to kind of move forward. And it's already shown that there are gaps in the response. We've also had to take on board software and making that really inclusive for digital provision. So the software that we use, you do not see yourself, you do not hear yourself, you can phone in, you do not need a computer, you do not need to have digital provisions. Also trying to work on Black, Asian, mixed ethnicities within our community, asylum seekers. And to go back to, I'm going really fast now because I'm Scottish and I'm against the clock, but to go back to what Elena said, I'm not an academic, I am actually a trained therapist, that's my background. So it's fascinating to hear that part of our job is trying to prove to our community through storytelling that your point of view is worth recording, your point of view is valued. Our community has been told all their lives, nobody cares about you, nobody wants to hear you, hide, hide, hide. So that's part of our job, and a lot of our community put so much effort into researching and getting dates right and collecting other information for us because they find it so therapeutic to be held, to be wanted, to be valued, and to go back in time and to realise that even back then, that can be valued to somebody in 200 years' time. And it would be a kind of disservice to our community for us to stop doing our work during the pandemic. And it's also a great opportunity to respect that a lot of our community has been through a pandemic, and again, we're getting stories full of resilience and aid and care and response. It's not all doom, gloom. Even when people are suffering challenges, they are experiencing bereavement, the response to that is inspiring and it is empowering for our community. Right?
Okay. Does that conclude what you were planning to say, Jamie and Dom? That's brilliant.
Yes, absolutely. I think one thing to point out is that the remote recordings that we're doing, we're looking at methods of doing this, and we're happy to share some experience of that with other people if they're interested in that. We're looking at double-ended recordings, but that's rather technical, and if people want to follow that up, we can do that later on.
But as they're experimenting with this to try and at least make an effort. It might not be to archive quality, but at least we'll have that effort. We'll have some sort of information to respond with. And again, like James said, we'll share it because it might be useful to other groups.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. That was brilliant. Thanks very much, both. I'm now going to pass on to Claire Patterson, an archivist at the University of Glasgow Archives. Claire's going to talk a bit about Glasgow University's approach and some of the more general issues in the university and special collecting sector. So Claire, I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. I'll just get a little bit of sharing the screen done. I'm sharing my code, so I will try and just because I'm going to move through a couple of different. I'm going to try and show you some things that are on the web. So I just try and keep technical as easy as possible. All finding it. My internet connection is unstable. So fingers crossed we'll get through today. Yeah. I'm based at the University of Glasgow, as Victoria said, but really and we are doing our Collecting COVID-19 programme there. But over the last 6 months, I've been part of the Collecting COVID-19 Scottish University Special Collection and Archive group, that is bringing our heritage sector across the university sector together, kind of share experience, our planning and our approaches and challenges in this phase of collecting COVID-19 for us. So there are collecting activities going on across SUSCAG members, so that's higher education, colleges, NHS archives, where we all have collecting activities going on, and being able to share our experience is proving very valuable. We have institutional and community collecting going on. Lots of us obviously are institutional archives and are continuing to maintain our institutional collections. And there's a community-based focus to some of the collecting going on as well. Really going on in terms of what we've heard already this morning is that one of the key factors that's coming through is the importance of the heritage sector's digital capacity to appropriately collect COVID-19, and echoing what's been said. All of us have been looking at our digital capacity and looking to build that over the last however many months and years to ensure the continuation of our preservation activities. I think really the last 6 months has proven how much we have to move forward in that area in order to accurately and appropriately collect what's going on at the moment. So we've got, like I said, like Victoria said, we're going to have a build from where Glasgow is in terms of our collecting activity, but bring in the approaches from across the SUSCAG network as well. So as kind of COVID-19 came upon us at the beginning of the year, obviously it was quite a sudden shift for everybody, but we took time at Glasgow to think about what our collecting programme would look like, and where we wanted to focus. So that was something that we wanted to have a sure footing in terms of what we wanted to do. Obviously it was a period of huge shift for everybody, but what we decided at Glasgow to do was to focus on how the university responded to the pandemic. So it was about how the university put in place processes, procedures and guidance to support university community transitioning to working, teaching and learning from home. And we decided that it was going to be the core focus of our immediate activity. So we looked at what action we had to take to capture that university record for permanent preservation. And here's some of the activity that we did to capture that. And that was particularly one of my colleagues, Emma Yan, did an awful lot of work sitting with web recorder software to capture this information, which is available online. And we had two really key areas that we wanted to focus on. One of them was the university exam cycle for 2019-2020. University exam papers is one of our big key series of records. We have a really extensive collection of exam papers, and we wanted to ensure that we captured the physicality is the wrong word, but the way in which our university community experienced the exam cycle this year, because there was such a shift from the traditional in-person exam to this entirely online exam cycle. And there was a phenomenal amount of work that was done across the university to actually make that happen, a huge amount of work from all sectors of the university to bring that together. And so we thought that was a really key area to put the work in to ensure that we captured that. So we did a lot of work to capture the processes that were put in place, the procedures, the guidance, and then we also recorded the system that was used to allow students to actually sit their exams. Our other key area was around about the communications. So that was looking at what the university was doing in terms of social media to keep the university community updated, and our Quarantine U of G social media programme that tried to bring the community together online. So we captured a lot of that, and we also looked at the internal staff and student communications that were going out, and we put in place procedures with our communications colleagues to ensure that that was routinely captured, and we will pick that up and bring it in for permanent preservation as we can. We also did some work to capture some of the online events that happen, such as Open Day and Offers Holders Day. So just that traditional in-person experience being brought into the virtual world, we wanted to make sure that we captured that going forward. I think we look at the institutional focus across the tag, really we see a lot of commonality of approach in terms of wanting to capture our institutional record and the shift in practices that our institutions have had to go through. So for example, Glasgow Caledonian University have a really clear programme set out in terms of where they are collecting. So they are looking at ensuring that they maintain those key university records in terms of procedures and communications and policy. Their approach is very nice in terms of it has this wide scale approach in terms of they are really keen to collect at university level, at service level, at team level, and at personal level. So they have a really wide approach that should capture what is going on across their institution. And then, for example, Glasgow School of Art, one of their key areas that they felt that they had to take action on very quickly was to capture their degree show. So for example, their degree show went online immediately. So went from that physical space into this virtual space, so this website, and their degree show was performed on, and so they've been working to bring that together and ensure that this is preserved as they go forward. I'm just going to have a little flick through the screen to show you really what it is that they are attempting to preserve, and so they are looking at that. So each of their students' work shall be maintained as part of the archive. Just as I mentioned, at this, when we were putting our programme together at Glasgow, we did see that we had to be focused on and get action on to make sure that we captured and preserved that record. There was lots of other things that we considered as well, but we put them to one side and are now potentially starting to think about how we pick up and slightly change the focus of our collecting programme. So I think what we potentially want to look at is some activities to widen our collecting activities to fully encompass the experience from across the university. For example, we've had a lot of COVID-19 research projects where we've been given money to undertake research, and we've had the Lighthouse Labs in partnerships. So we want to look at how we capture that. and then, for example, the 2020-21 academic session will be very different to what has gone before. So we need to look at how we're going to capture what the new delivery of services and teaching is, what that will look like, and how it will be delivered. From a very selfish point of view, from an ask perspective, our service delivery, whilst it will maintain some in-person consultations, we are really looking at a virtual service going forward, and we'll be developing our virtual collections classroom and virtual reading room. Those appointments are starting to get underway just now, but we're using visualizer technology in order to be able to show groups of students and individual researchers the collections that they need for their research and teaching. So, while we're obviously not going to retain every session that we offer, I think it's a good opportunity to say this is a big digital shift in the way that we deliver university services and teaching. Let's capture how we started that process, what it looked like in 2020, in order to add to the archive. So, I mean, I think that's a very quick run through some of the institutional focus and focused activities that are happening across the SCAG sector just now. But there is a lot of collecting going on in terms of that community focus, such as hearing from Wiebke. So for ourselves, we, again, for a slightly different phase of activity, we will be looking to reach out to our student organisations to ensure that we bring in of what they have been doing and student experiences over the last 6 months and beyond. It's been interesting to hear lots about oral history programmes and approaches to oral histories just in over the last hour or so. We had thought about doing an oral history programme, but our thoughts on that had always been to kind of put that further into our experience of COVID as we go forward. So really to look at that as a reflective account of experience across the university community. So we're not actively planning that programme just now, but it will be something that we come to look at how we get a diverse grouping of the university community together to share their accounts of the pandemic. Across the SCAG, as I say, there is a lot of key focus collecting going on. University of Edinburgh has a really broad approach to their community collecting programme, and Edinburgh, I think, were first. I'm probably overstating that a little bit. Lots of the archive university archive sector was quick to put together their key collecting programmes. University of Edinburgh have a very broad approach as deposits in a number of areas, and they have a board that will sit to consider submissions and to build that collection. Across the sector, we're seeing lots of diary programmes looking for people to submit diaries, submit their creative responses to pandemic, photographs, videos and audio that your experience of COVID-19. Where you get, particularly where there are NHS and university partnerships for archive services, and also with Royal Colleges in Edinburgh and Glasgow, you have particular health focus to collecting. So, for example, Clap for NHS, videos and photographs are being requested, and potentially more diary and reflective accounts from clinicians will be collected to support that kind of institutional archive. PPE is an interesting case where some services are looking to bring in physical collections to represent what members of their community are doing in order to produce PPE. So Glasgow School of Art have lots of their community producing protective equipment. Glasgow, for example, have services across the university who've been making face shields and things like that. So there's a lot of activity there that it's worthwhile looking to document and collect. I think just kind of wrapping a kind of very brief and swift overview of what's been going on. Similar to what's already been said this morning, I think collecting COVID-19 brings lots of challenges and opportunities to the archive sector. I think for myself, the foremost one is around about digital collecting and preservation. The sector is developing its digital infrastructure and the policies and procedures and bits of software that you need a little bit of everything in order to do digital collecting and preservation properly. But this phase is really an impetus for us to act and make progress in that digital infrastructure for archives. And it's really nice to see a developing SUSCAG community to support digital preservation across our member. And we're looking hopefully to potentially work more coherently and cohesively as a group with other services that do that. For example, the British Library Archive, the Digital Preservation Coalition. How can we work together to help us capture COVID-19? I think there's a real opportunity as well for SUSCAG to really interact with their research community and engage with them over what we are collecting now and how their research interests impact on the collecting activity that we're doing. So we're seeing lots of interest just now in 1919 Spanish flu, influenza epidemic. How does what researchers want to know about that pandemic help us understand what we should be collecting about COVID-19? There's also a theme around about current research data. We also have COVID-19 related research going on in our universities just now. How can we make links with researchers and with our research data management teams to ensure that we capture that research and move into an archive where that's appropriate? Obviously, the research data has a big requirement for digital preservation. Doing it, preserving all that data might not be something that we want to do every case, but there should be a thinking around about that. I think finally, one of the things to bear in mind with when we're looking at what collecting activity is happening here is to kind of just acknowledge the uncertainty that this current situation brings to all our lives and to all the activities that we're all doing as individuals and as services. And I think just the uncertainties around about how we go forward and how we do our collecting work. It has the very practical issues that we've been mentioned already, but how do we actually take physical stuff in? And also the digital, how do we make sure that we can preserve this appropriately? There's also kind of some kind of professional consideration to our collecting activity. There's obviously the ethical considerations that we've heard a lot about previously, but just in terms of how do we plan for a second wave? Do we change our collecting activity in some way for that, or do we maintain it? And I think Vika mentioned in terms of this is a long-term thing. COVID has long-term implications. So we're thinking a closure of our collecting activity is something that is very difficult to get your head around them. But this is not a short-term thing; it is a long-term thing, and it's something that we will have collecting going on for some. And years ahead, particularly within the NHS context, there will be collecting that goes on for many years. So I think that was a very quick run through from me in terms of what we're doing. I think for everyone across the university sector, just now, it's a really engaging opportunity to be involved in. So it's
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you for valiantly doing your presentation with the internet intermittent experience.
Well, fingers crossed it all came across okay.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Bruce now, and we'd invite people to put forward their questions.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. If anybody's got any questions, they could try and put them in through the Q&A bit at the bottom of the screen. That might be the easiest way to pick up. I'm not seeing any down there at the minute. So if you want to use that as a way of flagging up you've got a question to ask, while we just wait for that, I would, as possibly the oldest lag involved in this in terms of actually, collecting and selecting the stuff that was surviving. One thing that did strike me as part of COVID-19 is that, considering the scale of the Spanish flu epidemic in 1919, even 50 years ago, I don't remember seeing much material that related to that at all, surfacing through, if you like, the official end of records. It would be there in things like hospital admissions, but how many people were treated at home, how many people were treated at hospital? So, it starts to make you wonder how, we can compare the present situation to the previous situation. Now, Paula, you've got a question. Do you want to ask that through to Eleanor? Can you hear me? Eleanor, can you see the question from Paula?
Oh yes, I've just opened it now in the chat.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paula. Oh yes, you mentioned about the channel that was set up to discuss issues. It's called Slack, S-L-A-C-K. I can send the invite link as an answer to this. But essentially, yeah, it's just a platform that allows you to have chat conversations. And we also, when we're going to have events to discuss things, we'll advertise them on the Slack channel, and we also send it out on the archives listserv, and there's also a contemporary collecting listserv as well. So that's how it gets advertised when we're doing events and things. So yeah, I'll post the link in the chat there.
Thanks for that. Any more questions coming through? We've got about 5 minutes, I would reckon, until we can, till we need to move on to the AGM. I'm seeing 2 showing up at the bottom, but I'm not seeing, I think that might be Paula's, Paula's answer. I mean, I was interested here when, when Dom was saying that he's actually finding people coming to him to use the material that's already being gathered. That was really quite striking that is happening so quickly. And it does show that, this direct informational evidential value of record creation being recognised at an incredibly early stage in the process. I mean, that must be really it provides you with a validation of what you're doing in a way.
In a sense, yeah, absolutely, because I'm more of, give me a stage, I'll show up and I'll tell you a queer story about Scottish heritage, and that's, all the stages are shut, there's no community events, so it's nice to be able to fill that gap online, to be able to fill that stage online and have that opportunity then to share some recorded information, some pictures, just like what everyone's done. In a way, it's a much better context to show an archive as well as supplement it with stories. You can really contextualise the stories that you're telling in that space. And I don't think it has, hearing from the women from the Carnegie Trust the other day and saying that they are really pushing for local authorities to use artists, storytellers, using like community mapping events to gather information, because you can get more information than a survey or a consultation. And the community should be working with storytellers and artists, and that policy should be written based on that. And for me, that I'm not an academic. I don't see myself as an archivist. I'm a community activist, and this is part of that. That was validating for me. I think that would be validating for like a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes, why that is so important. So you can work with communities, and the stories that you share are legitimate, they're collected properly, that they're not biased, and you can have that legitimacy and that the resources and that responsibility to pass that on as legitimising it. It's good to hear. Again, I don't appreciate the importance of archiving, the process, museumology, all that, but I also think that things can't sit on a shelf and gather dust. And
no, that's never that. I mean, that is not really how archivists see it.
No. But that's
I know you understand that. Yeah.
This context, it's like, look how easy we can get this stuff out. Look how easy. You don't need to go to a museum. You don't need to go to the university. You don't need to pay a fee to visit and have that. You should have freer access, and we've got a responsibility to present this information in a way that's useful, especially in a global pandemic context when we're all kind of panicky and a bit on edge. Again, like our stories that we found, again, it's resilience and how people think we're all just sitting in our home panicking, but there's so many people out there doing mutual aid, organising COVID aid relief, food, digital provisions, and all those little community groups need to be recognised. They need their stories recorded as well, and it needs to be done properly.
I think one of the things that strikes me about the whole COVID event, for want of a better way to describe it, ongoing that it is it shows a major societal shift towards feeling that the views of the whole of society should be captured. You know, when you consider this in terms of any major, catastrophe the country or the nation, that any nation has faced in the past, we hear of the experiences of a very, very small proportion of the population. And the further back you go, the smaller the proportion is. We're now through the digital age at a point where actually it is possible to realistically capture this much more universal experience. And this, I think that's one of the things that makes this so difficult, for us to address now, because within the archival community, yes, that there are the core records. So in terms of this, there's patient records from hospital, there's documented, all the medical stuff as well. But there's all, if you like, what used to be regarded as, the softer stuff around that, which was more qualitative rather than quantitative. You couldn't crunch the numbers on it. It's not that kind of information. And COVID has really brought that right to the front, I think. At the same time, the lessons we learn from this are also ones we can be applying in a much broader context of how society deals with stress, for want of a better way to put it. I mean, how experiences were captured of the population in Northern Ireland during the Troubles is an interesting parallel to this. And, the issues that have been around retrospective capture of the experiences of extremists in particular, and all the ethical questions that have been around that, and just the same as ethical questions, as Eleanor was saying right from the start, there are ethical questions about capturing people's experiences in this. So, there's a lot more to it. It's not just about COVID-19, it's about how we actually change, the way we capture information generally. And I hope that's something that's come across for people this morning. I mean, it's something that I become more and more aware of. I'm fortunately not in the position of having to implement it anymore and figure out ways to do it, which is a nice position to be in. But I'm sure, you know, you'll all be responding. I mean, we've heard this morning that, you know, organisations are responding, rising to this kind of challenge, and, you know, in a variety of different contexts. And I hope, you know, if people have been, anybody that's, you know, in on the, you know, the webinar, I hope, you know, if you're worrying about it before, this has helped provide you with some kind of context and helped you be more confident in developing a response. And I'm sure any of the speakers, you know, that have been involved will be more than glad to, you know, provide support in any way they can. And I'd just like to thank you all the speakers for taking part in this. It's not always the easiest way in which to be contributing. I mean, I still come from I like to see people eyeball to eyeball, you know, so I can read their body language, you know, scratching of ears and all this kind of stuff. And it's not really like that in this kind of context. And I do appreciate very much, you know, how you've all risen to the challenge this morning. So I'd just like to thank you all on behalf of everybody for taking part.